In one way, one might say Gampopa is the most decisive figure in the evolution of the Kagyu tradition as a kind of institution, and in terms of the organization of its teachings, its doctrines. So he's a pivotal figure. I mean, he follows on from his two immediate predecessors in the line of transmission, Marpa the translator, and then Gampopa. And so Milarepa, sorry. So Marpa, then Milarepa being the immediate guru of Gampopa. So when Gampopa comes along, born in the late 1070s and to about 1150, he's over the point at which you could say there is the Kagyu tradition. It really does exist as an organized body with its monasteries, at least two monasteries, from where others will spread, and its characteristic Dharma teaching. So Gampopa's background explains that, why he has this pivotal role. Because as a young man, he's actually first of all trained as a doctor, and he marries. He has 2 children. But then, and one can imagine he must have been a very serious Dharma person, but he's a layman and doctor. But then his wife and children perish in an epidemic. And at that time, he decides to seek monastic ordination. So where would he do that? Well, he could do that within the Kadam school, which had started to develop from 1060 onwards at Radeng and other places, as the bearers of the teaching that Atisha brought, the great Indian scholar master Atisha brought in the 1040s to Tibet. So the Kadam grew out of Atisha, and the Kadam really represented, in comparison to the early Kagyus and Sakyas, a very monastic and very a monastic tradition, and one in which there's a strong stress on the graduated path, and in which Vajrayana was present but not so emphasized as among the more yogic streams of teaching like in the early Sakya and Kagyu, not to mention Nima tradition. So the Kadam represents, in a way, more or less like the first of what we'll see later, monastic traditions in Tibet, in a way. So Gampopa goes there in his late 20s and trains. He's very obviously an intellectual because he trains very systematically in the Mahayana teachings, sutras and shastras, as well as receiving some tantric teachings. And he's a very dedicated monk, very, very dedicated. But somehow this isn't enough for him. Somehow he hears, well, there's a romantic story told about how he hears the name of Milarepa being mentioned by some beggars who visiting his monastery, and this strikes him with a kind of force of revelation that this could be the Lama for him, this yogin. So anyway, this comes about, that he goes to find Milarepa, and that is very kind of something significant going on there, because Gampopa's an urbane, if we could put it this way, kind of very urbane, intellectual, monastic, quite a tame figure, one might say, if one wanted to put it that way. And Milarepa is nothing like this. Milarepa is this wild hermit, long-haired hermit, living in the mountains, nothing to do with monasticism, not much to do with scholarship, just all-out practice, contemplative, Vajrayana practice. So, and his disciples are mainly men and women like himself, fairly untamed, wild people, not monastics. But Gampopa comes and he stays with Milarepa for a year, only a year, not as long as Richumpa and the other disciples, but somehow Milarepa spots that he is going to be very significant. He puts him through a few tests, like force him to drink a couple of beer, and beer, although it's not a root downfall for a monk, is a no-no. So, but he forces him to drink it to kind of break his monastic pride, one might think. And it works, and he passes the test. And so he stays with Milarepa and receives some of his deepest, the core Vajrayana teachings, Vajrayogini, Jakasava, Nauchuduk, and Mahamudra. All things he's not received in the Kadam. So he gets this full-on Anuttara Tantra legacy from Milarepa. And then he leaves. And he goes off into retreat. But he's not renounced the Kadam side of his inheritance. He goes back and is in Kadam monasteries, meets some more Kadam teachers. At a certain point, when he's got problems with his health, he takes White Tara initiation from Geshe Drepa, one of his Kadam masters. So he's not renounced the Kadam, but he's practicing both and kind of trying to blend them together. He doesn't meet Milarepa again physically, because when he comes back to find Milarepa after 12 years, Milarepa's just passed. But nevertheless, he is going to be the lineage holder, the key lineage holder of Milarepa's teachings. So in other words, instead of the Kagyu tradition passing to Rechungpa, the other key disciple, wild yogi, many women, it goes to Gampopa, the monk, the intellectual, the organizer, the capable, monastic. And in a way, that's what makes the Kagyu survive. Yes, in one hand, it's the extraordinary charisma of Marpa and Mila and their spiritual attainments, but also it's Gampopa, who has spiritual attainments, by the way. One shouldn't think of him as a dry intellectual monk. He really does practice a lot after Gampopa gives him this teaching and gains great understanding, great meditative experience. But he can blend it together with his Kadam intellectual graduated side. So from then on we say Kachachuni, two streams, the Kadam stream that Gampopa inherited from Atisha with the graduated path system, 4 thoughts, relative bodhicitta, ultimate bodhicitta, 6 perfections, can be blended together with the Milarepa tantric teaching. So 2 streams become one. That is what Gampopa in his person and his teaching represents, the blending together of these two, which meant that Kagyu could become a fully functioning tradition in which you could, because one of the things that's obvious about the 4 traditions that survive and flourish in Tibet is every one of them, in its own particular way, reproduces the whole of the Dharma. So you can get the whole of the Dharma in any one of these traditions. They're not just side streams or specialities, they're universalist. So it's Gampopa who makes the Kagyu a universal system. The Kagyu name is being used by this time. I'm not going to know where that name came from, but it's Gampopa's, the Kagyu, the main Kagyu organizing teacher. He creates his own monastery at Dagla Gampo, and from then on, there's a turn to monasticism. Prior to Gampopa, it's all yogic. Now with Gampopa, it becomes primarily 90% monastic, in the sense that the major teachers are going to be usually monastics, not always. There are going to be some distinctions in that, some differences, but exceptions, but mainly it's going to be monastic. And Kagyu study is going to be first Kadam, then the Tantras, then the Mahamudra and the Vajrayogini and the 6 doctrines. And to kind of implement that program, Gampopa gives teachings like his famous text, The Jewel Ornament of Liberation, which is really essentially a commentary on Atisha's Lamp of the Path of Enlightenment, which he created as the teaching manual in his monastery and then spreads to the other Kagyu monasteries that quickly form in central Tibet and then in the other parts of Tibet. It's the main introductory teaching manual. Only when you've gone through that in a way can you then go on to the deeper, more advanced studies and practice. Gampopa does something else as well, which is, Gampopa is both a conservative and an innovator, a conservative and a revolutionary, one might say, in terms of he wants to preserve the full range of Mahayana teachings and not allow the Dharma to be entirely tantric, but he's a revolution because he seeks to bring about this new synthesis. And in another way, he's a revolution because if the key teaching, one of the key teachings he's received from Milarepa is Mahamudra, this tantric teaching from the Anuttara Tantras, which points to the true nature of mind beyond all technique and theory, through immediate introduction by the Lama, Gampopa finds that he can point to sources of this outside of the Tantras. There are certain Mahayana works, particularly the Uttara Tantra, the Supreme Continuity treatise on Buddha nature, which he says it's pointing to the same thing, that the Buddha nature teaching and the Mahamudra teaching are more or less the same. So that he says that many people can be introduced to Mahamudra and do Mahamudra meditation without the tantric basis, which Marpa and Milarepa have insisted upon. So he kind of makes Mahamudra more widely available. Of course, it's extremely controversial, and many great masters rejected this Gampopa's argument for this, but it becomes very strong in the Kagyu. Though again, later there's a resynthesis where even Gampopa's Mahamudra becomes reblended back with some Vajrayana. But that's a story for another day, of course. So by the end of his life, Gampopa has transmitted his teaching to a number of disciples, 4 key teachers who will carry it on, from which the 4 great Kagyu schools will come. To Karmapa Dusim Chenpa, a Lama from eastern Tibet, he transmits the teaching, and Karmapa Dusim Chenpa then founds the monastery of Serpu, from which comes the Karma Kagyu, probably the greatest, the most extensive of the 4 great. And then to his disciple Pamadrupa, who had previously been a Sakyapa, he transmits the Mahamudra teaching, and from Pamadrupa comes 8 minor branches of Kagyu. To his cousin, to his nephew Dapo Gomso, he transmits the Dharma, and that comes eventually the Salpa branch of Kagyu. And to the disciple from northern Kam, Baram Doji Wontruk, he transmits the Dharma, and from that comes the Baram branch of the Kagyu. So the 4 great and then the 8 minor branches of Kagyu all come from Gampopa, Gampopa's immediate disciples and their disciples. So he's truly the father of the Kagyu. So the Kagyu is, by the end of his life, beginning to be monastic and scholarly and a synthesis of Mahayana and Vajrayana. So an extraordinary kind of legacy comes from Gampopa. In recent years, Shama Rinpoche, the late Shama Rinpoche, of course, the 14th Shama Rinpoche, is very much concerned with kind of, restating the legacy and the positions of Gampopa as normative for Kagyu.